Chairman of the Housing and Insurance Subcommittee, Mr. Duffy, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to welcome the panel. Thank you all for being here today. For many of you, I want to thank you for the kind comments you made on our Corporate Governance Reform and Transparency Act. Many of you know we introduced this in the last Congress. Congressman Carney, now Governor Carney, and I worked closely together on this proposal. We had wide bipartisan support from across the aisle. This language is now included in the Choice Act. We hope that we will get good movement, not just here in the House, but also in the Senate. But I want to drill down a little bit with our panel and just, again, want to hear maybe Mr. Farley, Mr. Blake, concerns that you have about the transparency, the competition, and accountability of our, basically our two proxy advisory firms that now operate today, and Mr. Quadman too, if you want to jump in. Looks like
Sure. There's not a lot of transparency. Let me just put it that way.
There's not a lot of transparency.
Yeah.
Yes.
So Glass Lewis is a black box, and while there is some ability to, let's say, engage with ISS, that's actually been a problem as well. So I think we need to look at it in two ways. One is, and this is what I think your bill drives at, and what the SEC tried to do a little bit with their 2014 guidance is, one is there needs to be a process for how those firms actually develop their recommendations, and those recommendations need to be linked back to the fiduciary duty and economic return of their clients. I think there are also additional problems that your bill addresses as well, is the conflicts of interest of both of those firms, because each of those firms have different conflicts of interest. ISS with owning a consulting business, Glass Lewis being owned by an activist investor. So I think oversight is important, and I think it's a way to actually bring some rationality into proxy advice.
I would just highlight that this, too, is a small company versus large company issue. We recently had around about 25 listed companies gather at the New York Stock Exchange to talk about issues that were giving them difficulty, and this was one of them we discussed. And what we learned is that it's that much more painful for the small companies because, for example, the proxy advisory firms will have this opaque process. They'll come up with an opinion and they'll publish it at times without consulting the company or notifying them of what their process is or what their results are, and it will be published with some errors. We're all human. We all make errors from time to time. But because they haven't run it by the company, that's now out in the market, and it's very difficult for a small company without a public relations machine to be able to correct that information. And so that's why we're advocating for more transparency in terms of the processes of those proxy advisory firms, as well as more collaboration from them with those companies that they're opining on.
Mr. Blake.
Thank you, Mr. Duffy. I appreciate the work you're doing in this area. I have to echo Mr. Quadman and Mr. Farley's comments. You know, it really is an issue with the smaller issuers, especially around the transparency and the engagement that they have with the smaller issuers. Their methodologies tend not to be published, and we have to go through a process to discover what the methodologies are in order to comply with them. And the resourcing, which I think your bill addresses for the proxy advisory firms to engage with the smaller issuers, is very important. We want to be able to engage in a dialogue and at least explain our side of the story in terms of what our governance policies are, our executive comp policies are.
But if we look at these two main proxy advisory firms, and we look back in '87, institutional investors had 46% of our market. Now they've grown to 75%. Of the market. What role do proxy advisory firms have on corporate governance? I mean, it's substantial, isn't it?
Yeah. So,
and do they have the best interests of shareholders in mind? And does their one size fits all benefit shareholders or negatively impact shareholders?
let me actually give you one example with that. And, so with the passage of Dodd-Frank and through a lot of work of members of this committee, there's a provision in there on say-and-pay votes where investors and shareholders are supposed to determine the frequency of those votes, 1, 2, or 3 years, right? And what had happened, of course, for a proxy advisory firm, if you have an annual vote, there's a pecuniary interest in doing that, right? So, of course, the advisory firms immediately came out and said, no, there needs to be an annual vote. And, of course, that's exactly where it all then went. So shareholders were disenfranchised, Congress's intent was overruled, and the advisory firms profit from that.
That's right. So they made a recommendation that helped their bottom line, but wasn't in the interest of the shareholders.
Correct.
For your example, we get a lot of stories that come our way, but stories from one specific proxy advisory firm, ISS. We got one that came in that said, we heard, this is the ISS calling one of the companies, we heard he had a negative recommendation. So, and this, by the way, the recommendation isn't even out yet. We heard you have a negative recommendation. Oh, by the way, do you want to buy our consulting services? And there's supposed to be a firewall between the two divisions, but when their recommendation isn't even out yet, and here the offer's coming in to buy our services, that gives us some concern. That's like Vinny going, oh, I heard you were robbed last night. Do you want our protection services? It's outrageous, and I think this is, per your testimony, it's ripe for reform. And I'm getting tapped down right now, but I look forward to any other input you might have on how we could improve our product and get this across not just the House, the Senate, but improve corporate governance and the transparency and accountability of proxy advisors. I yield back.